They tell you never to run in a straight line on a battlefield. But when you have 72 pounds of steel and thickened gasoline strapped to your spine, and your boots are sinking 3 inches deep into loose, black volcanic sand, running in a zigzag is a mathematical impossibility. It was late February 1945, on the slopes of Mount Suribachi. The air tasted of sulfur and salt. 35 yards ahead of me, a narrow slit in a concrete pillbox was spitting an uninterrupted stream of Nambu machine gun fire into our pinned-down squad. I gripped the canvas straps cutting into my collarbones. I was carrying the weight of a 10-year-old child on my back, but this child was made of napalm and pressurized nitrogen. Every enemy sniper on that island had one standing order: kill the man with the tanks first. I listened to the high-pitched hiss of the hydrogen pilot flame on the nozzle. How do you cross those final 10 yards alive? The M2 flamethrower was not a tool of sadism, no matter what people who were never there might tell you. It was our only tactical answer to an engineered stalemate. Today, I am going to walk you through the terrifying physics of how this machine transformed a heavy liquid into a 1,000-degree wall of fire. I will break down exactly why the famous Hollywood scene of a flamethrower tank detonating like a massive bomb is a physical myth, and why the actual reality was far worse. Finally, you will see the exact tactical limitation that forced our life expectancy to be measured in minutes of combat rather than days. We did not want to carry this weapon. We carried it because standard infantry rifles and grenades could not crack coral and reinforced steel. If you want the version of this war that they do not put in standard textbooks, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The war in the Pacific was a fundamentally different beast than the fields of Europe. We were fighting against an underground engineering network. The Japanese defensive doctrine on islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa was never designed to stop us on the beaches. Their objective was to bleed the American infantry dry from inside reinforced concrete bunkers, dug deep into coral rock. Naval artillery fire with 16-inch shells bounced off these fortifications. Aerial bombardment did nothing but rearrange the sand on top of them. We would throw fragmentation grenades into the firing slits, and the defenders would simply throw them back before the fuse expired. M1 Garand rounds pinged harmlessly off the thick armor plates shielding the machine gunners. The Marine Corps quickly realized that you could not simply destroy the walls of these pillboxes. You had to consume the oxygen inside them. We needed a can opener for those fortifications, and that can opener required a man willing to walk up to the door. The men carrying these systems were usually 19 to 22 years old, drawn from the combat engineer and demolition squads. The M2A17 flamethrower acted less like a weapon and more like a mechanical parasite strapped to your body. It weighed 72 pounds, fully loaded. The setup consisted of 3 distinct cylinders. 2 large outer tanks held about 4 gallons of the fuel mixture. The smaller central tank contained compressed nitrogen gas, pressurized to 2,000 pounds per square inch. When you opened the master valves, the machine let out a distinct groaning hiss. The core limitation of this entire apparatus was time. You did not have minutes of sustained fire. You had exactly 7 to 9 seconds of fuel before the tanks ran dry. If you squeezed the butterfly valve a fraction of a second too early, you sprayed 4 gallons of fuel onto empty sand. If you waited a fraction of a second too late, the machine gunner in the pillbox would cut you in half. You never made that walk alone. Every flamethrower operator relied entirely on a fire team of 4 to 6 Marines carrying Browning automatic rifles and M1 Garands. Their only mission was to unleash a massive, continuous wall of lead directly into the narrow slit of the Japanese bunker. We called it covering fire, but it was really a wall of suppression meant to force the enemy gunners to duck below the concrete line. The noise was deafening. White dust from shattered coral would rise in thick clouds every time a .30 caliber round struck the bunker face. Without that team suppressing the slit, the man carrying the heavy tanks was just a slow-moving target on a firing range. The synchronization had to be precise down to the second. If the riflemen paused to reload their 20-round magazines at the wrong moment, the Nambu machine gun would immediately resume firing. The operator's life depended on his squad keeping that bunker blinded while he dragged his heavy boots forward. The anatomy of a bunker assault always followed a strict, punishing timeline. First, the platoon would take fire and hit the dirt, pinned down by interlocking arcs of machine gun fire from a position camouflaged by the natural terrain. The platoon commander would radio for the demolition and flamethrower team. As the operator, you prepared your gear inside a shallow artillery crater, turning the pressure valves to prime the system. You watched the pressure gauge needle jump. Then came the dead run. You had to climb out of your crater and cross the remaining 30 to 40 yards of open ground with zero physical cover. The sheer weight forced you into a slow, hunched walk, fighting gravity and the shifting volcanic ash beneath your soles. At 25 yards, you struck the ignition and depressed the main valve, sending the stream of fire across the gap. The math of the battlefield always caught up with you during that final, exposed approach. To understand why the weapon was so effective, you have to look at the chemistry sloshing around inside those two outer tanks. Standard liquid gasoline evaporates too quickly in the air to reach a distant target. The military needed a fuel that would stay together in a tight stream and stick to whatever it hit. The solution came from Harvard chemists in 1942, a thickening powder called napalm, made of naphthenic and palmitic acids. We mixed this powder into the raw gasoline to create a thick, sticky jelly. This mixture burned slower and much hotter than regular fuel. It clung to concrete, wood, steel, and uniform fabric. When you carried those 4 gallons, you were carrying a substance designed to adhere to surfaces while burning at temperatures hot enough to warp rifle barrels. The smell of the raw fuel constantly leaked from the old brass fittings, soaking into your canvas uniform. You could never wash that sharp, heavy scent of chemical fumes out of your clothes. The mechanical firing sequence was a multi-step process that required fine motor skills in an environment where your hands were shaking from adrenaline. At the tip of the projection rifle was a tiny hydrogen cylinder. Pressing a small trigger released a spark, lighting a continuous hydrogen pilot flame. This small fire burned with a high-pitched hiss and resisted blowing out in the ocean wind. When you finally gripped the rear handle and squeezed the main butterfly valve, the 2,000 pounds of nitrogen pressure forcefully slammed the napalm jelly through the hoses. The thick liquid passed over the hydrogen flame, ignited, and shot forward as a dense, burning rod. You did not fire in one long burst. You fired in half-second bursts. Squeeze, release, step forward, squeeze again. You had perhaps 14 short bursts in total. The humidity of the Pacific frequently caused the ignition spark to fail. If that happened, you were just spraying cold gasoline at an enemy who was actively shooting at you. The real terror of the job came down to simple geometry. The M2A17 had a maximum effective range of roughly 30 yards, 35 if you had a strong wind at your back. But the terrain in Iwo Jima often forced you to start your final approach from 40 yards out. That meant there was a 10-yard gap of open, exposed ground that you had to cross before the weapon could even reach the pillbox slit. 10 yards sounds like nothing until you are sinking into loose ash, carrying 72 pounds, while copper-jacketed bullets snap past your ears. You measured every single inch of that gap. You watched the white dust kicking up off the bunker as your rifleman dumped magazine after magazine into the opening. The sheer volume of incoming fire was the only thing keeping you breathing. You focused your eyes on the dark, rectangular slit in the concrete. The only way to stop the enemy fire was to get close enough to see it. There is a persistent visual born from movies that needs to be corrected right now. You have seen the films where a sniper shoots a flamethrower tank and the entire operator disappears in a massive, grenade-like explosion, taking out everyone in a 20-foot radius. That is a fiction. The outer fuel tanks contained thick jelly under relatively low pressure, and they held no oxygen. When standard full metal jacket rounds struck the tanks, they usually just punched neat holes through the metal. The napalm mixture would slowly leak down the operator's back, soaking his trousers in heavy fuel. You would feel the cold liquid running down your spine, knowing you were suddenly carrying a severe fire hazard. A regular bullet did not possess the thermal energy required to ignite the thick gel in an oxygen-deprived container. I want to know what you actually thought happened when these tanks got shot before you heard this. Drop it in the comments. However, the true hazard was much darker than a sudden explosion. If a Japanese gunner loaded a tracer round, which burns with chemical fire, and that round pierced the tanks and ignited the escaping vapor, the results were fatal. Alternatively, if a bullet shattered the high-pressure nitrogen cylinder in the center, the sudden mechanical rupture could atomize the leaking fuel, creating a highly flammable cloud around the Marine. When ignition happened under these specific conditions, the operator did not explode into shrapnel. He simply became a human torch. The canvas straps holding the heavy steel frame to your shoulders took precious seconds to unbuckle. Men burned alive under the weight of their own equipment, unable to shed the 72 pounds of steel anchoring them to the volcanic sand. You watched your friends turn into pillars of fire, and you still had to pick up your own rig, prime the valves, and walk toward the exact same bunker that just killed them. The second misconception concerns what the weapon actually did to the men inside the fortifications. People assume the primary cause of death was direct external contact with the fire. While the napalm certainly caused severe burns, the true lethality of the M2 in a closed environment was biological and invisible. When you inject a stream of 1,000-degree burning jelly into a sealed concrete room, the fire demands immediate oxygen to sustain itself. The combustion process instantly vacuumed every ounce of breathable air directly out of the pillbox. Furthermore, the superheated air expanded rapidly. If a defender inhaled during that fraction of a second, the searing ambient heat would instantly scorch and destroy the microscopic alveoli in their lungs. The men deep inside the tunnels did not have to be touched by a single drop of napalm to die. They suffocated in the dark as the ambient oxygen vanished, replaced entirely by thick toxic smoke and lethal carbon monoxide gas. I was still pressing my cheek into the black volcanic ash. The Nambu machine gun rounds cracked through the air inches above my helmet, sounding like heavy canvas ripping. The advance of our platoon had entirely stalled. Then the platoon commander yelled my name, pointing a dirt-caked finger at the bunker up the slope. It was time for the tanks. I rolled onto my knees in the artillery crater and hauled the heavy canvas straps over my shoulders. The dead weight of the 32 kilograms pulled hard against my lower back. I reached back, turned the pressure dial, and heard the sharp hiss of the nitrogen priming the system. I pressed the igniter switch on the rifle nozzle. The continuous, high-pitched whine of the hydrogen pilot flame confirmed I had ignition. I looked over the lip of the crater at the 40 yards of chewed-up earth separating me from the black slit in the concrete. My mouth was entirely dry. I pushed off my back leg and stood up. Instantly, I became the largest, slowest target on that sector of the beach. I forced my legs to pump, but the loose sand swallowed my boots past the ankles. To my left and right, 4 Marines from my squad stood up and leveled their Browning automatic rifles, dumping heavy .30 caliber fire directly at the bunker slit. White coral dust exploded off the bunker face. For 2 seconds, the incoming fire stopped as my squad paused to swap their empty magazines for fresh ones. In that brief silence, the Nambu opened up again. A bullet snapped past my neck. A second round smashed hard into the metal canteen attached to my hip, throwing my balance off and spilling water down my leg. Panic spiked in my chest, a brief terror that the impact had struck the fuel tanks on my back. What happens next took less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that ended 81 days. I kept moving forward, closing the distance to 25 yards. The wind coming off the ocean suddenly shifted, blowing directly against my face. If you fired the weapon into a headwind, the heavy, burning jelly could blow right back onto your own uniform. I had to adjust my footing, widening my stance in the loose dirt. You had to anchor your boots solidly because the physical recoil of the liquid ejecting under 2,000 pounds of pressure hit you with almost 90 pounds of backward force. Every instinct in your brain screamed at you to squeeze the trigger at 40 yards, to do something to stop the incoming fire. But if I squeezed the butterfly valve too early, the fuel would fall short, burning harmlessly on the sand. The decisive detail of this job was discipline. You had to endure the terror of walking toward a machine gun until you reached the absolute edge of the weapon's effective 25-yard saturation zone. At 20 yards, the dark opening of the pillbox filled my vision. I planted my left boot hard into the ash, braced my shoulder, and squeezed the butterfly valve tight against the rear grip. The mechanical linkage clicked. A deafening, guttural roar drowned out the gunfire. The compressed nitrogen shoved the napalm mixture through the internal hose at dozens of feet per second. The stream caught the pilot flame and ignited. It did not spray out like a soft cloud of gas. It shot forward as a tight, cohesive rope of orange and black liquid fire. The recoil instantly pushed my upper body backward, forcing me to lean heavily into the weapon just to keep the nozzle aimed level. The burning gel arced through the gray battlefield air, cutting a bright, straight line directly toward the narrow horizontal opening in the concrete. The physical heat radiating backward from the stream felt like standing in front of an open industrial furnace. The mechanics of the thick fuel performed exactly as the Harvard chemists designed them to. The burning rod of napalm struck the upper inner lip of the concrete firing slit. Because the liquid was thick and viscous, it did not stop at the point of impact. It ricocheted off the angled concrete ceiling and splashed heavily downward, flooding the interior compartment of the pillbox. This was the splash effect, the precise tactical advantage of using thickened fuel instead of pure gasoline. The jelly broke apart upon impact, throwing burning, sticky clumps around the sharp corners of the internal blast walls. It painted the walls, the floor, and the heavy steel mount of the Nambu machine gun in a thick coat of unextinguishable fire. The napalm adhered to everything it touched, burning intensely and rapidly consuming the ambient oxygen in the enclosed space. The stream maintained its pressure, continuously feeding fresh fuel into the dark, enclosed bunker structure. Even from 20 yards away, the thermal radiation was intense enough to singe the fine hairs on my forearms through the heavy cotton sleeves of my uniform. Thick, oily black smoke poured out of the bunker's ventilation shafts, carrying the pungent, unnatural scent of burning fatty acids and scorched rubber. The Nambu machine gun immediately went silent. I held the valve open, keeping the stream centered on the slit, watching the flames curl back out of the opening. It worked, because I had forced myself to wait until I crossed that 10-yard gap, ensuring the maximum volume of fuel entered the fortification. Squeezing early would have wasted the pressure on the outer wall. Squeezing here guaranteed total internal saturation. The heavy pounding of the Japanese machine gun was replaced by a deep, rumbling whoosh of the fire feeding on the chemical mixture. No rifleman from my squad fired another shot. We just watched the smoke billow upward. Then, the pressure gauge dropped to 0. The deep roar of the stream suddenly broke into a hollow, sputtering cough as the central cylinder expelled its final pockets of nitrogen gas. A few flaming drops of gel fell limply from the nozzle onto the sand near my boots. The tanks were entirely dry. 7 seconds. That was all the time it took to drain the 4 gallons of fuel. In the middle of a combat zone, 7 seconds feels like an eternity of noise and heat, followed by an abrupt, jarring silence. The machine on my back was no longer a weapon, it was simply 32 kilograms of useless heavy steel. I reached up and pulled the quick-release pins on the canvas shoulder straps. The heavy metal frame slid off my back and hit the sand with a dull thud. The sudden physical relief of shedding that crushing weight made my spine ache and my legs tremble. I drew my M1911 pistol from my hip holster and took a knee in the black sand, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The anaerobic effort of carrying that load under fire left my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the pistol grip. From the interior of the bunker, sounds emerged that will stay lodged in my memory forever. They were not the sounds of soldiers fighting. They were the raw, biological sounds of extreme human suffering in the dark. My fire team advanced quickly past my position, rushing the flanks of the concrete mound. Two demolition men threw blocks of TNT directly into the smoking slit to collapse the interior walls and seal the position permanently. The operation was over in less than 2 minutes. The threat was neutralized. I sat in the dirt, smelling the sulfur and raw gasoline, knowing that the platoon commander would point to another bunker before the sun went down. The cost of using this weapon was measured in the men who carried it. We suffered casualty rates that broke standard military logic. In some specific landings on Iwo Jima, units lost up to 92% of their assigned flamethrower operators. Japanese snipers would let radio operators and officers walk past their sights just to put a bullet into the man carrying the tanks. You lived with a target painted on your chest. Beyond the physical danger, the psychological toll of the weapon was severe. Using standard artillery from miles away allows a soldier to distance himself from the reality of the strike. Standing 20 yards away, watching the physical effects of burning humans alive, leaves a permanent mark on the operator's mind. Even against a hardened, unyielding enemy, the sheer mechanical cruelty of the M2 created deep, lingering cases of battle fatigue among our men. You never truly washed the smell of that oily black smoke out of your uniform. The M2 flamethrower did not win the war in the Pacific single-handedly, but it made victory mathematically possible on those heavily fortified islands. Without that heavy pack, infantry casualties during the island-hopping campaigns would have been orders of magnitude higher for every square yard of coral taken. However, the severe nature of the weapon eventually sealed its fate. The infantry flamethrower was largely retired by Western military forces and deemed politically unviable for standard infantry operations. Today, modern militaries use single-shot thermobaric rockets to clear fortified bunkers. These modern systems explode and consume the oxygen from hundreds of yards away, keeping the operator safe and anesthetizing the soldier from the close proximity reality of the kill. But in 1945, there were no thermobaric rockets. There was only the courage of men like Herschel Woody Williams, who earned the Medal of Honor for strapping on multiple M2 rigs and clearing out networks of pillboxes with his own 2 hands. Those of us who carried the tanks do not talk much about the mechanics of the fire or the sound of the pressure valves to people who were not there. We remember the weight of the canvas straps cutting into our shoulders, the taste of volcanic dust on our teeth, and the long, exposed walk across the open sand. We remember the men who did not make it across that 10-yard gap, anchored to the dirt by the heavy steel tanks they carried. The M2 was a harsh tool built for a harsh environment, demanding everything a 19-year-old had to give in exchange for 7 seconds of fire. The next time you see a photograph of a Marine resting on black sand, look at the heavy brass nozzle resting across his lap, and remember the distance he had to walk to use it. If this story deserved to be told, make sure someone else gets to hear it.